In this class, we look at oral traditions in written form and consider some of the earliest examples of Pacific Islanders who began to write down oral traditions. In the next few videos, we're going to consider some of these questions. How and why did literacy develop in Polynesia? Who recorded oral traditions in written form? And what are the challenges of changing oral traditions into written text? You may already have the answer to this last question based on your assignment and your experiences looking for oral traditions, and in some cases changing them from oral forms into written forms. As we look at this topic, we will focus on examples from Eastern Polynesia. This include Tahiti and Hawaii. Can you think of any examples of pre-colonial literacy? That is, examples of writing in Polynesia before Europeans arrived. There is one example that comes from Rapa Nui, and this refers to the Rongorongo tablet, a tablet that was found on the island with a number of different symbols on it. Archaeologists don't know exactly what these symbols mean, but they are considered a form of pre-colonial language, maybe one of the earliest forms that developed in the Pacific Islands. You may be aware of similar carvings or symbols that might appear in other parts of your own islands. These are sometimes referred to as petroglyphs and are often carved into rock faces or into cave walls. These may have served different purposes, either as communication or perhaps spiritual or religious purposes. But in many cases we may not know for sure because we don't have a key or a way of unlocking this ancient code. There are also some wonderful examples of pre-colonial numeracy. Today, there is a great interest in understanding how Indigenous Pacific Islanders practiced mathematics and other scientific skills to understand their worlds. In this short article produced by PBS, it identified an ancient numerical system on the island of Mangareva. Mangareva is part of the French Polynesian group today, and a couple of psychologists found fascinating evidence that this early number-based system may have resembled what we might call a binary system today. That binary system is often used in computer coding. So it's quite amazing that Pacific Islanders had complex systems of communication and calculation well before Europeans arrived. Now let's focus on how literacy began to develop in Polynesia with the arrival of Europeans. Literacy in Oceania had its beginnings in Polynesia at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries. It developed and spread as a result of the work of the first Christian missionaries, as they began to teach the people of Polynesia the skills of reading and writing as a necessary key to their evangelical mission. One scholar, called Parsonson, wrote what he termed the literate revolution in Polynesia, because it described the almost universal enthusiasm for the new culture or literacy in the island world after 1815. The earliest mission work began in Tahiti and Hawaii in the Eastern Pacific. In Tahiti, missionaries of the London Missionary Society arrived in 1798, and by 1815 John Davies and his team had successfully recruited the Tahitian king Pomare to their cause. In Hawaii, progress was similarly rapid, so much so that by 1830 there were 22 books printed in the Hawaiian language. The work of devising standardized orthographies increased with the expansion of mission implantation further west across the Pacific, as far as Fiji by the 1830s, and including nearly all of the island kingdoms of Polynesia, including the Cook Islands, Samoa, Tonga, and Aotearoa. By the late 19th century, literacy in the major Polynesian languages had been achieved, largely through the efforts of the members of the London Missionary Society. By the end of the 19th century, there was widespread tradition of literacy throughout Polynesia. It was not until later that serious efforts were made to transfer those literacy skills to the mastery of colonialist metropolitan languages such as English and French. Literacy rates are very high in almost all areas of contemporary Polynesia, reflecting the contribution and dedication of the earliest evangelicals in this part of Oceania. If you're wondering what the image is on the right of this screen, you can click that URL link at the bottom of the page to find out more about printing presses. These were machineries introduced by European missionaries, which allowed texts to be written and reproduced in much higher volumes and quantities. And this was key for early missionaries who wanted to produce Bibles and other religious texts in indigenous languages and publish them so that they could be spread and circulated throughout the islands. There are some examples where these printing presses are still existing today in the islands, whether they be in museums or in derelict states elsewhere in the Pacific. It's important to remember that printing presses and writing in indigenous languages has been occurring for quite a long time. Here is an example of an announcement about the printing press. The words here are written in Rarotongan, and this poster was printed in Rarotonga in 1849. It's an image I found through the Auckland Library's heritage collections. And if we translate this image into English, it says, "This is an announcement about the printing press. In ancient times, these things were not familiar and could only be written on parchment, the skin of sheep. Then there was the printing press in Britain in the year 1449. That was 400 years ago from then up to the present time." Not only was the printing press a quite incredible piece of technology, but many historians have written about the way that the printing press revolutionized communication and introduced new ideas in Europe when it was first introduced there. Less has been written about the impact of the printing press in Polynesia and the wider Pacific. But we do know, probably you also know in your personal lives, the influence that missionaries has had on the Pacific. And the printing press was a key tool that missionaries used to aid their efforts to convert and evangelize. So the printing press not only supported missionaries, but would later become a very important way in which Pacific Islanders could share communications through indigenous means, such as indigenous newspapers, indigenous magazines, and other print materials using indigenous languages. So printing presses were not just restricted to English and French publications. So that brings us to our next question. Why was literacy encouraged in Polynesia? Literacy was viewed as a way to engage with Europeans. And if you're looking for specific details, I've included a reading on Moodle by Parsonson from the Journal of Pacific History, which gives some wonderful detailed examples. But perhaps you can think about your own examples based on what you know already or what you can find online. Let's think about some of the ways in which Pacific Islanders may have wished to engage with Europeans in the 18th and 19th centuries, and why literacy may have been an important way to facilitate that engagement. The first is missionaries. As we've already discussed, missionaries were some of the first people that arrived in the Pacific, and they were some of the first to introduce literacy as a concept. and a practice. Pacific Islanders adopted literacy as a way of converting to these new Christian religions, but also a way of achieving education. Remember, missionaries were some of the first people to create schools, formal schooling systems in the Pacific Islands. So learning languages and literacy was a way of seeking further education. Missionaries were also active in providing legal advice. Some may know the most commonly known example of Reverend Shirley Baker, who assisted King Tupou I in creating Tonga's constitution. So to understand European or Western laws and legal systems, which guided many of their interactions, Pacific Islanders needed to be able to read these laws and to understand them. So literacy was also important in understanding these legal systems because they would impact everyone's daily lives through crimes, through land use and reforms, through the documentation of other legal or official ceremonies. Commerce may have also been another way in which literacy served an important role. For example, in the early 1800s in Tahiti, there was a very vibrant trade of pork between the colony of Sydney in New South Wales and the islands of Tahiti. And so, being literate meant that you could help work in this trade by using documents to understand how many pigs were being traded, to sign contracts and agreements between people living in the colony of Sydney and people in Tahiti, to ensure that this trade could facilitate and to deal with these Europeans who were driving this trade. A similar trade existed very early on in Hawaii with furs and seal furs, in which many indigenous Hawaiians were traveling around the Pacific, but also over to the western seaboard of the United States of America. And so in doing so, they needed to be able to read immigration documents, read maritime rules and laws, to be able to understand and write in these languages. So commerce was a really important way in which Pacific Islanders had to understand European and Western commercial rules and ways of doing business so that they could participate in that trade. And lastly, it was through official correspondence. After missionaries and traders had arrived in the islands, they were often followed by official diplomats, consuls, and military officials. These people would often rely on the written language to communicate back to their homelands, also to deliver important messages or official communications. And so to engage in this high political level of discussion, one needed to have familiarity with literacy. As we can see in all these three examples, literacy was encouraged by those in power to consolidate power. So literacy, being a form of knowledge, was really a key way in gaining and consolidating power. And so we'll see that the chiefs are one of the earliest examples of people who really catch on to the importance of literacy as a way of furthering and maintaining their power. In the next videos, we'll look at some examples of this in Tahiti and Hawaii.